Hello, and welcome to the Mothers of All Crime. This is a podcast where we deep dive into mothers involved in infamous crimes and scandals. I'm Monica, and this is Crystal. Our mother this week is Waneta Hoyt. This is sort of a different kind of case, but I think it's interesting to talk about. Had you ever heard of Waneta Hoyt before we started talking about her for this?
I had not known a lot about her, but I definitely had heard her name through the research for our Gypsy Rose episode, but I didn't really go into any of it.
Interesting.
And
Interesting.
I think now that we kind of went into it more, I'm now understanding a lot more why those names are associated. So I think there's a little bit of a correlation there. But other than that, I hadn't really heard much about her because this was a case from a while ago. I was busy being born during her trial, so
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely old. I mean, Waneta was born in 1946. You know, she was, she. It's all old. It's definitely all before our time, and the dates of what the events that happened, and later when this became like a public event, are also extremely far apart. So I think that timeline wise, I'd be kind of surprised if you'd heard about her a lot. I actually saw her. There's an episode of Deadly Women based on her, which I tried to rewatch again to talk about for this podcast, and I can't find season 3 anywhere of Deadly Women.
Ooh.
I have every streaming service possible, and season 3 is not available. So if anyone listening to this has access to season 3 of Deadly Women, I would love to watch it.
What a
Send me an
weird
Instagram message or an email. But I'm always shocked if there's something I seriously cannot watch, because I feel like we have every streaming option, so it should be available, but I can't find it anywhere.
In just that season.
It's just that season. And season 1, you can find some of it on YouTube. But season 2 and season 4 and beyond, I think there's like 12 seasons. They're all available on Discovery Plus, Hulu, HBO. Season 3 is nowhere.
Weird.
Yeah,
well,
it's pretty weird.
We'll give our own recap of this Deadly Woman.
Definitely. There are also some good books that have been written about her and her life. And I read one a few years ago, which I am happy to plug. Goodbye, My Little Ones by Charles Hickey, Todd Leidy, and John O'Brien. I'd recommend it. There's a few. There's also The Death of Innocence. These are all on Audible, Amazon. And they're good. They're interesting because it has a lot of interviews with family members. And to me, that's always interesting. But I guess we should talk about who Waneta Hoyt is, and what her timeline looks like.
Yeah, so she was born Nixon and ended up getting married, which is where she got her Hoyt last name. And Tim Hoyt, who was her husband, they got married in January of 1964. She actually dropped out of high school to get married to him. And I think that kind of just shows the time period difference here, where most of the mothers we've talked about recently and also in modern days, if not, people aren't dropping out of high school to get married and start a family, they tend to prioritize their careers a little bit more, particularly women, which is a huge shift from women in the 60s.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, Waneta grew up very, I don't know if lower middle class is the right word, but her family did not have a lot of money, and they were on a farm, and she was the 5th of 6 kids. So I think that there was some pressure kind of to get married, and also that was kind of the assumption of what she was going to do. And her mother had always said that women were here to be wives, to be mothers. That's how she was raised. She was taught how to do a lot of domestic things growing up. Certainly, education wasn't prioritized. I don't think she was ever going to go to college. So I think that for her, getting married was just what you do. And she was
Right.
only like 16, which is important. And when they got married, she did drop out of school. And Tim Hoyt was also from a farming family, and they didn't have a lot of money. So she moved in with his family, and that's where they lived in like the early years of their marriage, was with his family. And so it wasn't like a glamorous newlywed experience. There was no honeymoon or first place together or anything like that. They were just living in a room at his parents' house on their farm.
Yeah, and this was in New York too. And I
Yeah,
think if you had told
upstate.
me upstate, yeah, if you were talking about New York City, it would surprise me that she moved in with his family. But considering they can't both came from a farming community, you worked a lot and you worked for the family farm. So it wasn't super
Hmm.
shocking to me that she went from her family house to her in-laws house just because of the
Yeah,
nature of kind of what their families did for a living. And
for sure.
I mean, maybe the original thought was we'll just have a place on the property because he's not gonna just magically decide to not work for the family at such a young age. You have no other options in that kind of area and that time frame.
For sure. Definitely. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it made sense for them at the time, and I think it was a common thing to do. But it definitely gave the Hoyts an interesting, they spent a lot of time with Juanita when they
Yeah.
first got married because they all lived together. So they were all able to observe her. He has a lot of siblings, and they noticed some things with Juanita in the early times of their marriage before any pregnancies or children happened. Like, she had a lot of fainting spells in front of family members. Anytime that Tim's attention seemed to be focused elsewhere, Juanita would collapse. And she would also be sick all of the time with various ailments. Um, I saw one thing that said that his family called it Nita-itis.
Oh
Every
goodness.
little every little thing, and that they would play a game where they would describe made up symptoms that they were having and take bets on how long it would take before she was also having those symptoms. So I think for Tim's family, they thought that she was a bit of a hypochondriac, and there's some weird things going on with Juanita. But otherwise, they seem like a super loving, happy couple, like obsessed with each other, all over each other.
Yeah. But like how funny as like a family. This is why I can't have a hypochondriac as an in-law because I think that's hysterical that they just
Me
would like
too.
start talking about sicknesses and just wait for her to suddenly have it. That's awful. Totally not okay, but also very funny.
It's very funny, and I do think that it's true. For people who have hypochondria or some form of that, where they're very scared or they always think they're sick, anytime you're sick around them, they also have it. So I
Right.
think that it's funny, and it makes sense. I do think it's significant also. And then Juanita got pregnant really quickly after they got married, within a couple of months.
Yeah, and again, very normal for the situation. At this period, a lot of people still believed in that very large family dynamic where you have a lot of kids and birth control wasn't
Hmm.
super supported like socially. And also when you're growing up in a farming area just like his family and her family, you have kids to work the farm that you need help. So the more kids you have, the more help you have. And it doesn't the young women, and I don't know how accurate this is, but I've always been told like the younger you are, the easier it is to get pregnant when you're doing it with intention. So it feels very similar here where it's time to have babies and then very quickly she gets pregnant.
I mean, that's definitely true. It's just an unfortunate fact of biology. I mean, after the age of maybe 17, you're way more fertile than you're going to be after 27. And there's a more steep decline after like 34, 35, 36 in female fertility, but between 20 and 27 is kind of ideal. And some people are fertile much younger than that. And you tend to get pregnant faster and be able to, bounce back faster after having a baby if you have them in your late teens or very early 20s. So I guess it's not surprising that she got pregnant right away. And they had their first child, Eric Hoyt. And this is where the real story kind of starts. Because at first, Juanita is really reveling in the attention of being pregnant and having a baby, and it's all very exciting. And I think that that's fair enough. And she's only 18. So she has this baby, and within a couple of months, he has passed away from what was called or suspected to be sudden infant death syndrome. Juanita was home alone with him. He went to sleep. He never woke up. They weren't able to revive him. He didn't have an autopsy. He was buried. It was very, very upsetting. But, there really wasn't any more to make of that. So Eric was 3 months old and Juanita was 18. And they mourned and they moved on. And they had a second child, James, who they called Jimmy. And he was an extremely healthy child, very active, very boisterous. He, was kind of an answered prayer, and things were going pretty well with that. So they had a third child, Julie, and she was also healthy at birth. Nothing was suspected to be wrong with her at all. But she only lived for 48 days. And she was home with Juanita and Jimmy, and she choked on rice cereal, which I'm not an expert, but 48 days is not when they start eating. You know what I mean? I think that's usually more like, I think the earliest you can do that is 4 months.
Particularly
But
cereal. Unless, like, my only thought is that she was feeding James and somehow the other one got a hold of it. But again, like, no 40-day-old baby is grabbing and putting things in their mouth. They're kind of just big lumps and wiggle. Like,
exactly. So I read multiple accounts of that day from what Juanita said happened, and she said that she was feeding Julie a bottle with milk and rice cereal in it, and the baby started to choke, and so she ran out into the street and flagged down someone that was driving by to try to have them help her. Um, which it just seems like not like that doesn't seem. I don't know what I would do in that situation, but I don't think that that's what I would do. I think that I would be trying to dislodge food and I would be calling 911, because this is not, I mean, this is 1968.
58.
Like, there are
Yes.
phones. You have a home phone in 1968. So
Yeah.
it's a little odd. It's a little odd.
It is. And I think it is important to note that people have very different reactions to, like, traumatic moments like this of fear, and there's a lot of people that just don't know what to do and they panic and look for someone else. But then you have that maternal instinct thing that we always hear about, where women have this ability to do things that normally they couldn't when their child's life is at risk. And I agree with you. Like, your first instinct, you would think, is to somehow I might hurt you, but I'm going to do whatever I can to dislodge whatever's in there if you're choking. Just like the mother who
Right.
like picks up a car because her kid's underneath it, they're going to do whatever they, for some reason, all of a sudden you can do this, but you're never going to be able to do it again. So you would think that she would be willing to be more aggressive, trying to get it out of their throat rather than just leaving them unattended. More than one, too. So she has a toddler hanging out, an infant choking, and she's going to leave both of them unattended to go flag someone down. Sketchy.
It seems like a weird reaction. I mean, it is possible that she completely panicked and she flipped out and she just was desperate for someone else to help her. I just I don't know.
I'm going to
It
use
doesn't
it.
seem
Agree.
quite it seems a bit a couple of things with a couple of things with Julie seem a little bit odd to me.
I'd agree with that.
But also, she doesn't have the internet as easily as I have it now, where she could just look up when do babies start eating rice cereal mixed with formula or milk. Um, but it's her third child at this point. It seems like
Yeah.
you would know how to feed a baby, but
Right. And I think
yeah,
at that time frame too, like you build communities of other women, and unlike women now, for the most part, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of women that get taught this, but as a parent, your primary goal isn't teaching your daughter how to feed a baby or tend to everything. Your primary goal might be making sure they do their homework and they graduate school and get a job and be responsible for themselves. At this point, there's not a doubt in my mind. She knew how to do it. She knew the age. Because in that period of time, you're taught those things a lot earlier because that's what's expected of you. You're expected to become a mother. So you need to know those things.
that's a good point as well. So, little weird, but okay. So, the family is mourning. Julie is buried. Everyone is absolutely devastated, except for, little Jimmy. He's only 2 years old, so he's not very affected by the passing of Julie, because he just doesn't really clock what's going on.
Valid.
But, and he seems to be a very exuberant child. He runs, he walks, he jumps, he speaks, he plays hard. And then a couple of weeks after Julie passed away, Waneta said that he started bleeding out of his nose and that he collapsed and he died.
Again, so we're on baby number 3 who has passed of
The third to pass, but the
strange
second born,
circumstances.
yes. So he is the oldest of her children so far. Um, but yes, a couple of weeks after his baby sister dies, he is mysteriously dead. And this is the first time one of the children got an autopsy, because it's just such a bizarre event. And an autopsy did not demonstrate any bleeding or hemorrhage in the brain or skull. And they weren't really able to point to a specific cause of death for Jimmy. There were notes that his adrenal glands were undersized and that his thalamus was oversized. But I think that it's been later shown that the person doing his autopsy, the coroner, actually had his age wrong and
Mhm.
thought that Jimmy was supposed to be 4 instead of 2. And the thalamus does not, like, that would make sense that his adrenals are undersized and his thalamus oversized, because a 2-year-old should have a larger thalamus than a 4-year-old. So
Sure.
I think that there's really nothing wrong with him on the autopsy, and that his adrenal glands were not undersized. He just is 2 years younger. But there is no cause of death that's determined. It's just undetermined.
Yeah, I read somewhere that due to it being undetermined, they ended up classifying it also as SIDS, similar to Eric's cause of death, because they just couldn't
Hmm.
figure out what it is. And
Right.
SIDS is one of those things that I think gets blanketed where
Oh,
unfortunately
definitely.
sometimes things just happen. And even now, with all the advancements we've had since this point, this late 60s, early 70s, we still have incidents where they just don't know why something happened. And I think back then too, when you had even less knowledge than we do now and less tests, Sid's got a lot of cases where it was just hands thrown up, no idea. Here we are.
Yeah, because SIDS is not really a diagnosis. It's if there is no other cause found. And now there's something called sudden child death syndrome, which is similar to SIDS, but it's for children that are older because SIDS doesn't really apply, but that term had not been, like, it hadn't been differentiated
Right.
at that point. So it was just all kind of blanketed, like, it's SIDS, it's SIDS, it's SIDS, it's a respiratory issue, essentially. Um, but this is the point where some of Tim's family members started to think that it was very strange and that Juanita's story about what happened with Jimmy didn't really make sense. Um, and it is not the same pattern as the other ones for sure. So I think nothing. It's very tragic. It's very sad. I think the family was absolutely devastated. They were very involved with Jimmy, and this is a point where there started to be some changes in feeling. Family members were telling them not to have more children. This is clearly not working out for you guys because now three of their three children have passed away. And this is the first time that family members started to think that maybe Juanita had some sort of factitious disorder. It's not what they called it then, but it's what we understand it to be now, where is this being imposed on the children? And Tim absolutely did not think that to be the case. And Juanita, was not saying that that was the case. So, and these were classified as medical deaths, tragedies. But I think it's caused a bit of a shift in the family at that point. And
Absolutely. Because
they,
they also had a lot of doctors coming in saying that there could be some kind of genetic component to it. And if you're passing this down to your children, and from a family perspective, it's just inevitable that your next kid's going to have another issue. If you have three thus far having problems and doctors questioning if it's a genetic component, why would you risk the heartache, but also bringing another human into this world just for them to have their life be over before they're even three? So I can see the perspective that his family's having with all the different components kind of put together.
yeah, absolutely. But they were not deterred and they immediately
No.
started trying to get pregnant again. And Juanita had a miscarriage. And then they applied to adopt and ended up withdrawing that application because they got pregnant with the fourth child, Molly. And at that point, they started doing some very extensive medical testing on Molly. She had extensive tests done before leaving the hospital that were all normal. And then she had a spell of apnea, sleep apnea, at home with Juanita, who brought her to the hospital. And then the second she was at the hospital, her testing was all normal. She was released, and then she went home. and she had another sleep apnea spell. Juanita had to do CPR, and um, she went to the hospital, and no cause for that was found.
And Molly
So,
was maybe 3 months old, give or take, 3, 4 months old at this point. So it's not like this was they had a kid and this happened a couple years later. This happened almost immediately after her giving birth. There started to be issues.
right. And this is where a very important figure in this case and in SIDS in general comes into play. Dr. Steinschneider is a medical researcher, has written many articles about sudden infant death syndrome. And he was doing a large study about the relationship between sleep apnea and SIDS. And Molly became a patient in his trial, and she was monitored for sleep apnea, and all of her testing was normal there as well. So she was monitored, and her testing was all normal.
Mm-hmm. Which again
Only
gives
thing
that
that
red flag of because it's hard to look at it when you have all these incidents and someone's saying something is wrong, but your tests are coming back normal. You have this middle ground where you, as a doctor, question, okay, so then what's going on? If all these are normal, but this is the result, something has to be going on. And if something is going on, it can be extremely frustrating. But also, there is the alternative that there's something more suspicious going on, I think is the word I want,
mm-hmm.
versus
Yeah.
a medical concern.
Yeah, absolutely, because they are at this point really taking a lot of steps to determine a medical cause so that this tragedy does not happen again in this family, because they have been through unimaginable horrors. And so there's an entire team of people really trying to determine if there's something that is wrong, something that can be fixed. And Molly is passing all tests at the hospital. She seems totally fine while she's there. She did have a couple of incidents where the nurses were like tapping her feet to make sure that she was in a good breathing rhythm. Babies do sometimes have pauses in breathing. That's not necessarily deadly or sleep apnea, but nothing requiring major intervention happened at the hospital. There were some nursing notes that were released later that said that Waneta seemed very detached and distant from Molly. And I think that that could be very understandable because she had suffered so much and had to grieve her other children. So it would be, I would think, very difficult to be attached.
Yeah.
But it drew some attention.
Yeah, I think there's a multitude of concerns there where you have the history of her other children, the possible fear of something happening to this child, but also that sometimes, like postpartum, that you just gave birth and you're trying to figure all this out. Like, there could be a number of reasons. And it's very easy in retrospect to look back and be like, oh, yeah, well, she was acting weird because she was attached, versus in the moment of just being kind of figuring out what's happening. So I don't know. I took that one with a grain of salt, just with the
Mm-hmm.
circumstance, because this is all happening very quickly. So I don't know. I know what happens, so I get it, but like trying
Yeah,
to think
for
of in this
sure.
moment.
I
Um,
just think it's interesting that it was mentioned in the notes at all. It must have been pretty apparent for it to be something that they felt had to be included in nursing
or
notes.
that's a
It's
good.
not extremely relevant otherwise. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe she just, had very nosy nurses that were all up in her business.
Also
Um,
possible. Hmm.
yeah, some people are like that. So she was in a little cycle of being at the hospital, being at home, having sleep apnea spells, and going back to the hospital. Um, and she was not having any of these spells in the hospital, as I already said. And 2 days after being released from the hospital, Molly passes away. She's home alone with Waneta, suffers a spell. They're not able to bring her back. And there's no cause of death listed on her autopsy.
Again, devastating. Rule
Devastating.
decisions.
Yeah.
Unsure.
She's only 2 months old.
Just a bunch of question marks.
Mm-hmm.
So normal people would think that that would deter you from having children again or taking some time to kind of process another death in your home and another death to one of your very, very, your baby, basically. But not for her.
Yeah. Because they actually applied to adopt again and
And
then
she almost
withdrew.
immediately becomes pregnant again.
I
And
know,
you
but
do,
that's what I'm saying.
yeah.
Is like not only were they trying to get pregnant immediately, they also were applying to adopt. It
Why?
was, which I think can be, I want to look at it with like a little bit of empathy as well, because I don't think children are replaceable. I don't think loved ones that die can be replaced. But I do think losing a child or losing a pregnancy, a lot of times a normal reaction is to want to have another child or another pregnancy, not to replace them, but just to fill their arms, fill their home, fill their hearts. You know,
Yeah.
it's
And we've seen that a couple times with other cases we've talked about where something tragic happens and more children end up coming into the picture because it can be a
yeah,
healing side. But when you have a quote genetic concern, you would think that they would stop going for the biological side and just focus on the adoption side.
that would have been different for sure. That would have changed, would have maybe changed things a little bit. We'll revisit adoption, but she did get pregnant again with baby Noah, turns out,
Mm-hmm.
and he became a new patient in the SIDS clinic that Dr. Schneinsteiger is running. And he is there for his entire first month of life. He had 800 consecutive hours of monitoring, all normal. And he went home for 1 day and had a sleep apnea spell, needing CPR, and he went back to the hospital for weeks.
It's just,
And it's, yeah.
yeah. All right. I know it's happening. I know it's coming, but go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that Tim at that point decided to get a vasectomy because he was like, this is genetic. This is a problem with us, and I'm not going to do this anymore. And so he got a vasectomy. So Noah would be the last biological child they would have.
I just can't believe it took them 5 children for him to make this determination. That's what I think is wild to me.
I think it's wild too. I think probably would have been better to do that earlier,
Like,
but
CD
you
number
know,
2, this is clearly not for us. Like, time to move.
yeah. I I don't know. I do understand that, you know, if it's really important to them to have children and like having a vasectomy can feel so final, like this is really a door closing. And so I think that it was being put off, and Juanita did not want him to do it. So
Which is hard when your spouse is telling you the opposite. So I think that definitely probably played a much bigger factor than we're considering. Because again, it's retrospective. But if you're at
yes,
home,
definitely.
they probably had many conversations about that prior to. And if he's
Hmm.
getting the no, you can't do that, blah, 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 it would make it really hard to go follow through with it. So I guess that's a good point.
I think so. Um, so Noah's back in the hospital. And again, nursing notes are implying that Juanita is cold, distant, and weird towards Noah, that she seems jealous of him when Tim comes to visit, because Juanita was there a lot and Tim would come after work. And when he would come in and want to give Noah attention, Juanita would physically put herself between Tim and the baby. She would sit on his lap. She would have her arms around him, and she would seem very distant towards Noah. In the nursing notes, I wasn't there, but that is what they said, the people who were there.
Right. And that brings me to question, I think that there was definitely some kind of issues going on in their marriage as well, because there's no way you can have this much death and trauma so close to home and not have it affect your relationship. And you got to wonder how much attention she was getting outside of the house or inside the house during this period. So if she was already having issues, like he'd come to see the baby and she's doing everything in her power to get attention. And historically, she has a problem when he doesn't give her attention already, let alone when his attention does need to be somewhere else.
I think that makes sense. And by all accounts, Tim is completely racked by grief. So I think that he probably is consumed a lot in his own thoughts and his own demons at this point, and maybe Juanita is not getting the attention she needs at home. Noah's in the hospital. Juanita's weird. Tim is not giving Juanita enough attention, possibly, or she is seeking his attention a lot in front of the nurses to the point that they're writing it down and that they're also bringing it to Dr. Schneinsteiger's attention. And he's very dismissive of it and thinks that they're not being sympathetic or empathetic to everything that these poor people have been through, which I also think is a reasonable take.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in total, so I don't know how I want to phrase this, but Noah was released from the hospital again, and one day later, he had an apnea spell and he died. He only lived for 81 days, and 78 of those days he was inpatient in a hospital.
Yeah.
And he had an autopsy, and it said respiratory difficulties and was labeled as SIDS. And they had a funeral. Juanita fainted at the funeral. It was all extremely devastating, of course. And that is the last biological child of Tim and Waneta Hoyt.
And I think it's good to kind of put this into a time perspective. So, Eric, their first child, was born October of 64. And then Noah, their fifth biological child, died in July of 71.
Mm-hmm.
That is 5 births, pregnancies, and deaths within 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not like we're talking about over a 10-year, 15, 20-year span. We're talking about a very, very short period of time for so many children. It's not just 2, it's 5 and 7 years.
Yeah, definitely. And they were not premature
Yeah,
children.
full term children, healthy, what appeared to be healthy. It's it's a lot in such a short time that does seem very strange.
Yeah. Like, more than half the time of those 7 years, she was pregnant. And I mean, so Jimmy lived the longest at 28 months. Everyone else was around 2 to 3 and a half months.
Right.
But yeah, it's a lot of time being pregnant, having babies, pass away. I mean, in a 7 year period, it's a lot of children to have under the best of circumstances. But yeah, it's very much back to back.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think another timeline thing that's crazy to me is so Noah passed away in July 1971, like you just said, and in August 1971, they temporarily adopted a 9 month old baby.
And
It's 1 month.
emotionally, how? But the other part of me goes, okay, so they put him for adoption probably months before and never withdrew it. And then you have a knock on your door saying, we have this baby who needs to be placed somewhere temporarily. Like, how do you say no to that?
Oh, for sure.
So I
I,
have
I get that. I just think that they should have been flagged as like not because their children are dead, but because they are mourning these
right.
horrific losses. Like, how could they be in a mental place to adopt a child, foster a child? I mean, it says temporarily adopted or placed with them on several different things. I'm not really sure if he was a foster child or.
That's my thought. Is it was more of like a foster situation when it is a temporary placement. It's not a long term place that they were intending to keep the child.
Mm,
Where I think Scott was his name.
yeah.
That there may have been an adoption in progress with another family, but things hadn't been finalized and birth mother couldn't have him anymore or whatever the circumstance was, that he was in the adoption system or waiting, the rights had been signed over. There's definitely that gray period between legally, and I think that's how they
Hmm.
ended up with him, that they just needed someone to put him to bed every night, because
Right.
it's a lot
And I mean, they
easier
couldn't have
also to
possibly
place an
legally
infant
adopted him
into
in a month.
adoption. Right. It's a process.
Hmm.
And it's a lot easier to get a baby adopted than like a 14-year-old. So they probably had someone already
Absolutely.
set up to take him and just hadn't figured out the paperwork yet. But someone had to hold him in the interim.
Mm. So they have him for a little bit, and then I think it's within a week. Juanita had a nervous breakdown, told Tim that she thought she would hurt Scotty, and was admitted to a psych ward.
So did
And
she tell Tim or did she tell a psychiatrist?
so she
Or both?
she was saying things to Tim about how she felt like she could be a danger to the baby, a danger to herself, making comments like that. And he contacted the emergency psychiatric unit in their town, and she was admitted to the ward, and that's when she made more statements
Got
about
it.
Scotty specifically to a psychiatrist who reported it. And Scotty was brought back to the adoption agency. She made she made comments about him crying and how the crying was driving her nuts, basically, and which is a poor choice of words on my part because she's in a psych ward. But I have a quote here that says that apparently she said to a psychiatrist in reference to Scotty, "I feel as though I'd like to wring his neck."
Mm. Which is not something you say when you're in a psych ward. That's something you say when your kids are like adults and you're talking about when they were being
Right.
annoying. Like,
Right. I mean, Scotty is 9 months old, so I don't know what he could possibly have done. But also, she'd only had him for a few days at this point. So she's making these alarming comments. She's diagnosed with depression. She's getting medication for it. And Scotty is brought back to the agency.
which is the poor little
And
baby.
I know. Poor little guy. So, I mean, I hope that he ended up with a loving, wonderful family after all of that. And it was really just a blip on his baby radar that he doesn't even remember.
Oh, I'm sure. And looking back and what we're going to talk about soon, for the best, really.
Oh, in so many ways for the best. So, this is this is a point where they have no children, and Waneta is really struggling mentally. Um, so I have a bunch of oh, this is what I really wanted to talk about. She had told a doctor that she wanted to get a hysterectomy, and there was notes made by that doctor saying that it was a form of self-harm that she wanted to get a hysterectomy, which I just think is interesting.
Hmm.
And then she told people and told physicians that she would not be able to move on with her life if she was still living in the trailer home that her and Tim were living in, where four of their children had passed away. And a couple of months later, the trailer burned down while Waneta was home alone. And an insurance paid for a new trailer.
Listen,
Interesting.
I'm all for moving after something like that. Very traumatic, very upsetting. But sometimes financially you just don't have that option.
Yeah.
And you have to make it work. Or your house could burn down for questionable circumstances. Option B.
Option B. Yes. I mean, because at this point, they are swimming in medical debt. Waneta has many, many ailments. She is constantly at the doctor, constantly going to the hospital, taking many medications for different issues that she's having, and they cannot afford it. And they had to file for bankruptcy multiple times. So it wasn't a financial option for them to move until the trailer luckily burned down while she was home alone.
But magically not with her in it.
Nope, she was not injured. This is also around the time that Waneta was calling Tim at work and threatening self harm and suicide and lots of different things. And he would call his sister to go check on her, and the sister would go, and Waneta would be totally fine. And they would have like a lovely afternoon together. And it happened multiple times, a pattern. Um, but I think that, she was lonely. She was home alone. She didn't work. And Tim was gone long hours of the day because they had a lot of expenses. So that was a solution to it, I guess, was just to, bring Loretta in.
Well, it gets someone's another set of eyes on her, which I
Mm-hmm.
think was something that he was very concerned about because as any good husband would do, if your wife's making statements like that, you don't want her to be alone. So I see why he did it. They're very fortunate
Sure.
they had someone to be able to do so and it didn't impact his work because at this point they have to have an income. So
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think Tim is. I don't really know what I think of him, but I do think that he was really trying to be very supportive and was drowning financially and emotionally. And it is a good thing that his family was so involved. But it just, I don't know, it kind of speaks to a larger pattern, I think, in Juanita's life. Cries for attention,
yes,
which
very consistent.
everyone needs attention. Yeah, it's very consistent. Um, and then I think we're up to about 1972 at this point. So, about a year after Noah has passed away and Scotty has been returned to the adoption agency, where the article based on the SID study that Noah and Molly were a part of was published in a journal called Pediatrics. And this was a game changer in the field of SIDS research, in pediatric care, in recommendations that were given to new parents. This was something that was used and taught and spoken about all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Talking about apnea monitoring for SIDS and how there's a genetic link. And that is a huge impact of this case because this really changed the way that SIDS was viewed by the medical community for a long time. And so I just think it's important that that article came out at that time.
Right. And nobody knew it was them. They were referred to as the H family. So
Right.
there was still the anonymity to it of having her secret kept, I guess, is a good way to put it. Because this
Yeah.
became very popular and very public knowledge and something very big. It did end up years down the road getting discredited, but at the time,
Yes.
very important knowledge and groundbreaking stuff that they were putting out.
Yeah. I mean, initially it was very well received. And I don't know what Waneta thought or if she ever read the article, but it was about her children were mentioned as examples and in the research and used as data points, but it's not like it was a story of their lives or anything like that. And they were anonymous. Yeah, it was just initials, which is important too. But that is something that's happening in the world. And a couple other things are happening in Juanita's world. She accused a neighbor of sexual assault in 1974, and no charges were ever filed. And I was not able to find anything substantiating that,
That's news to
but
me.
I
I
guess the
didn't
charges
even
were never.
find that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They also had another trailer burned down and got another life insurance payout. So
Insurance
quite
pays,
flammable.
not life insurance.
Oh, you're right. Home
Honestly, if
insurance.
she had life insurance for all the babies that passed away, she probably wouldn't have need to had her trailer magically burned down again.
Well, that is a good point. Um, so in 1977, they adopted another baby, Jay, at 2 months old. And this baby goes on to live. Spoiler alert, he's still alive. Jay Hoyt was adopted at 2 months old, and Juanita's mother in law, Tim's mother, was heavily, heavily involved in his care for the first 2 to 3 years of his life. She was essentially with them
Which is
night and
valid. As a mother-in-law, if my other children were suddenly couldn't make it past a year, I also probably be like, I'm moving in now. I live here.
yeah, yes. So she was round the clock childcare with them, and Jay flourished. He healthy child, free from these genetic problems that were plaguing the other Hoyt children, and they became a happy little family that Tim and Juanita had been striving for. It was not perfect bliss, and there was an incident when Jay was around 11 when he got a puppy, and it made a lot of noise and it made a lot of messes, as puppies do. And Juanita had another nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. I guess, fortunately, soon after that, after she got out of the hospital, the dog got out and got hit by a car and passed away.
So
Otherwise,
things just don't stay alive near Juanita is pretty much what we are establishing here.
yeah, I think that's
Except Tim. Tim
yes.
is great. Tim's
Tim's
doing all right.
Tim's good. Jay's good. They're still good.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but right. So that's. I mean, it's quite a series of events to digest, but life is going on for other people, and there are other situations coming up in the world and in New York. And there is a man in New York who essentially faked SIDS um, to collect life insurance on three of his children. And this was discovered because there was this researcher named Linda Norton who had published articles about child abuse, about how parents will sometimes cover up child abuse with medical problems. And she became a very sought after, very expensive medical expert testifying in courtrooms. And she testified in this case saying that there is no genetic link to SIDS and that this was a financially motivated murder, three murders, and the man was convicted, as in no small part because of her testimony. And this is important because after this case has resolved, Linda, the expert witness, tells the prosecutor about another case where she believes there's another serial killer in New York. She doesn't know the name. She just tells this is William Fitzpatrick is the prosecutor. And Linda tells him about Mrs. H, which is what Juanita was called in the article. And there's a lot of there's a lot of nothing happening for a while um where Fitzpatrick didn't act immediately. He went into private practice. He eventually read the article, but he still didn't know who Juanita was or anything about the actual family. He became the DA and um, was able to find out who. So the case of Waneta Hoyt is finally being investigated, really for the first time. And multiple medical pathologists look into the autopsies, review it, and the deaths the deaths seem suspicious. They don't fit with the characteristics of SIDS, especially Jimmy and Julie's deaths. They don't make sense. The kids are described as turning blue during their apnea spells, which is also not consistent with SIDS. But the problem with this case and why it hadn't really been investigated before is there's no real motive for why any other reason the children are dead. Like, if there's a murder, what could possibly be the motivation for it? Children did not have life insurance policies. They were innocent little babies. Why would someone do this? And this is where the allegations of factitious disorder imposed on another come up. It's also known as Munchausen's disorder by proxy. And I think that that's probably the best explanation for what's happening here, assuming, what you think happened. But she was approached by the police in 1994, which is more than 20 years after the children had passed away. And she was told that she was going to be helping the police with SIDS research. So she went with them willingly. She brought an album of her five biological children, pictures of them, showed them to the officers. The officers were very sympathetic and they were getting a lot of information out of her, but she wasn't saying anything new or anything different until one of the cops, who was a woman who was a mother, told her that they knew her story was not true, that they had medical experts saying that this could not be SIDS, that it was murder, and Juanita confessed. She said she wanted to silence the kids.
And that's where I question the Munchausen's kind of diagnosis here, because from our previous conversation, kind of focusing on Gypsy Rose, a lot of that is you're putting medical issues onto your children to get attention for yourself. And
Mhm.
in this situation, she got rid of her children, which kind of defeats the whole purpose. There was a lot of situations where the attention was on the children and she got jealous and tried to intervene. So it makes me wonder if it is more just of a person more just being heartless and doesn't want to listen to a crying baby, and people trying to justify a reason on why a woman would kill multiple children, her own children. I think it's more of society trying to figure out a justification rather than an actual explanation.
Sure. It definitely could be. I mean, the only reason I think that she has been ascribed to have this is because she had it for herself. And people who have Munchausen's or they have factitious disorder where they're imposing illnesses on themselves are more likely to do it to their children. And I think that when the babies were having all of these apnea spells and there were funerals and there were multiple pregnancies, I think that during those she got a lot of attention. It was just it was like the excitement of the chaos of each medical emergency, but I think that the boringness of being in the hospital or having months go by with nothing happening, I don't think that she enjoyed that as much. I think that
Fair.
being a
That's fair.
mother, being pregnant, you get attention, and then she's this tragic figure. And I think you do get attention for that. It's very negative attention, though. Most people wouldn't want that. But,
What's
I
that saying
mean,
about press? All press is good press. I think in this
yeah.
circumstance, it's the same where all attention is good intention for
Hmm.
her.
Hmm.
And even though normal people don't think so.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that most people would think that what she went through was beyond belief and absolutely horrible. And it still was. She still had to live through all of those things, but did she cause them? I mean, she said that she did, but she also recanted that statement the next day. She
Claiming it was
spent the night,
coerced.
she said it was coerced. She said she was manipulated by the police. She spent the night on suicide watch in a jail cell. The next day, recanted. She pled not guilty. Tim bailed her out. I mean, she says that it was a false confession, that she was pressured into it, that she's basically a frail woman, because that was another thing is she looked very old and she looked very sick, and
Right, because
she's a
your
sympathetic looking figure.
3-month old is going to put up such a fight.
Exactly. I mean, at this time though, I mean, it's been 20 years since then. And I mean,
Yeah.
she was convicted. The trial, I didn't really find a lot of interesting things about the trial itself. Um, just that she was convicted, got 75 years, which
Yeah, she got 15 years for each murder, and then they were ordered to be served consecutively. And I agree. I think a lot of it was very standard when it came down to a court case.
mhm,
It was interesting. I think the only kind of thing that stuck out to me was the fact that she had so many personal testimonies saying that they didn't believe it,
mhm,
saying she was this amazing person and good mother, like not a good mother, but like shocking that this would have happened to her, and that like she babysat someone else's children and it was fine. Like you had a lot of these testimonies that were shocking considering you're
mhm.
being charged with 5 counts of murder of your own children.
Yeah, and Tim and Jay were in the courtroom every day. And Jay, her son that she raised for, they adopted him in 1977. He was a teenager when she was investigated in the deaths of these siblings that he had never met. So I'm sure, I mean, I know that they supported her and still do. There's a lot of people who didn't think that she had anything to do with it. But if the deaths were ruled homicides, Juanita was the only person that was with the children when they all passed away. So, in that sense, it's pretty open and shut, I think.
Yeah, that's gotta be hard watching your mother, who you know to be a relatively good mom, maybe, we don't know. um,
True. We don't know.
on trial for this because I couldn't find anything about him and his opinions on anything. They kept him pretty out of it, which I think was good from a parenting perspective. But as a consumer, I would have liked to know his thoughts.
Well, I mean, she did file for an appeal, and we'll never know what would have happened with that because she died 3 years into her sentence from a real disease, pancreatic cancer. So technically, she has been exonerated.
Yeah, so August of 98, she passed. Um, and it's just crazy to think that all of this happened and she, I don't know, it was guilty, but like there's that weird question mark afterwards just because of the way the law works in New York. So I'd be curious. I would have loved to have seen it go back, but at this point, she was older.
Yeah, I mean, she was only 52 when she died, but the pictures of her, she looks so old.
Oh my
And
God. I
her,
never, she was 52 when I first saw the pictures until I saw her age.
oh my gosh, I know. But she had lost almost all of her hair prior to that, and she had not been battling cancer. She had a host of different medical problems, she claimed, but I I didn't find anything that would explain all of the hair loss that she had. And she was extremely frail. But
I mean, it
I
could have just been stress or
yeah,
another way to get attention
alopecia.
or yeah, alopecia, like something that wouldn't have necessarily been public knowledge.
Yeah, that's true. So I think that Juanita is probably a serial killer. I'm just going to jump into what I think. I think that she killed the kids because I don't think it makes sense that they're SIDS, except possibly Eric. Possibly the first one could have been SIDS. And I think maybe if Eric happened to die from SIDS, maybe that gave her the idea for what was to come, because I think that she probably did receive a lot of attention. And I was looking at risk factors for babies to die from SIDS, and one of the big ones is if the mother is younger than the age of 20, which was only true for her first
Interesting.
child.
It has to do with an age. That's peculiar to me.
Well, there's multiple risk factors. So, smoking cigarettes, which was much more common at the time. I don't actually know if she smoked cigarettes or not. Drugs and alcohol, the sex of the child is a risk factor. It's more likely to happen with boys than with girls. She had three boys and two girls that all passed away. So, I mean, it is more boys, but I'm just saying for Eric specifically, the first child. Um, and then the highest risk factor in your age is between 2 and 4 months of life. Eric was 3 months old. It's more likely to happen in,
It's very strategically placed for sure.
yeah, that's true. But I don't know if she knew any of these things. He was not premature, so that's not one of them. And he's not of Black, Native American, or Alaskan Native infants, which are another big demographic that it happens to. But I'm just saying, this has always kind of been what I've thought of this case is that Eric happened to die from SIDS and she got a high from that attention and was seeking it after that. Perhaps she was also just a terribly abusive mother that wanted to hurt the kids, but I think it was also about the attention that she would get from everyone else.
Yeah, I got to agree. I think attention definitely had a factor to play here, but I also honestly think that it was a lot of anger towards the
Mm-hmm.
children
Mm.
that she thought that having after like got pregnant that afterwards these babies would bring her more attention and the reality was the babies got the attention and not her.
Mm.
And I think it stirred anger in her that she didn't control. And I think there were circumstances that the first time probably was just a reaction. I don't think she probably meant to kill him, but then realized A, she got away with it. B,
Mm-hmm.
that it brought all this other attention directly for her. So, second baby, okay, maybe things will change. And then it didn't. So the same thing happened. I don't think it was a need for attention. I think she got jealous and it just spewed out.
It definitely could be. I do think she was jealous of the kids. And I wonder if when, because I do think that she killed Julie, the second baby that passed away, the third child. I think maybe when Julie passed away, it didn't, she wasn't being suspected of anything. And it just gave her the opportunity to get rid of her rambunctious toddler. Because I really think Jimmy's death as a 28-month-old makes the least sense of anything.
Oh,
And
I
I think
agree.
the more you get away with it, the more you're going to try to get away with it. And I wonder if she knew that if she did something to one of the adopted children, that even Dr. Schneinsider was not going to believe that there was some sort of genetic thing killing the kids. So I wonder if maybe
Right.
that's why she had to get rid of Scotty, get away from him.
Yeah.
And
And I think by the last time, there were too many eyes on her. Her mother in law was living
mhm,
with them. There was,
mhm,
and then they got old enough where they weren't as annoying to her, I guess.
could
Because
be.
at babies just cry. Like they have no other way to communicate, and that can be
Yeah,
really frustrating. So if you're already short-tempered, I think by the time her son got to be a teenager, or at least a, I don't even like 4, when they can kind of communicate and understand social cues to a degree, that he was safe. I think that's the only reason that he made it this far.
I think so too. I think that she was so heavily supervised with Jay, and that's the only reason that he's alive now. But I also think that Juanita, maybe she was not very educated, but she was not stupid. And I think that she knew that she would not be able to get away with it again.
Right,
So she
because
just couldn't.
she openly said it about Scotty that she couldn't be trusted with him, and I think you're right
Hmm.
when it's she made that admission because she knows if it were an adopted child that is temporary, so technically not their children, it would be far more looked into than
That's
the
true too.
suspicious circumstance of her
True,
own.
true. Because the adoption agency, the foster care system, whatever it is, there are a lot of other people involved. That's a really good point. There's probably caseworkers, social workers. Like, this kid can't just turn up dead.
Right.
There's going to be questions. Yeah. Wow. That's a good point.
Yeah, either way, it's devastating. I'm glad at least one of her children made it, which is terrible to
So
say,
sad.
but
Yeah.
um, I hope that he grew up and found comfort in his family that did support him around, because I don't know how you kind of come back from having a mother who is being charged and was charged and convicted of something like that. I think that's really hard to come back from.
I'm sure it really warped his whole childhood growing up hearing about these siblings that had passed away. And then for his mother to be charged and convicted with their murders when he's almost an adult had to be earth shattering. As far as I'm aware, Tim supported her until she died, so I don't know what he was saying to their son in the aftermath of all of this, but I mean, I just would think that that would mentally be so difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I agree. All right. So, Miss Hoyt, do we have any final thoughts for her?
I don't think so. How about you?
I don't think so either. I think we covered everything that I wanted to mention, and I'm just glad at least one of them is hopefully having a productive adult life.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope he's doing well. All right, well, till the next mother.
Till the next one.